In everyone's life, there are moments when it seems all moves are calculated, and every obvious path leads to an inevitable dead end. Have you ever felt trapped in a predictable cycle where your every step, every decision, as if scripted, leads to the same frustrating outcome? Perhaps you're repeatedly making the same mistake, unaware that it's hidden within the very logic you're accustomed to following. This isn't just about strategy. It's about how our own thought patterns become our worst enemies. Today's story, which we want to share with you, isn't just about a daring military maneuver. It will make you rethink the very concept of an obvious and right path. Forget everything you've been taught about the shortest distances in direct attacks. Sometimes true victory lies where no one expects it. We will show how one man, faced with seemingly inevitable disaster, dared to break all patterns and defy everything considered reasonable. This changed the outcome of an entire battle, and perhaps it will change your perspective on your own challenges. So, let's transport ourselves to September 28, 1944. Ngibus Island, Palau Archipelago, a place where the Japanese command seemed to have considered absolutely every detail. Before we delve into this astonishing story, we ask you, stay with us and watch until the end? We would be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, please write in the comments where you are watching us from. We are very interested to know the geography of our viewers. Major General Hoshi Imamura's forces had transformed the narrow spit, connecting two land masses, into a perfect kill zone. Every mortar was meticulously sighted. Machine guns created interlocking fire, leaving no dead zones, and artillery coordinates were calibrated to the last meter. 470 defenders, hidden behind reinforced concrete fortifications, carefully watched the only route by which, according to all military manuals, American Marines could advance. Every amphibious assault guide stated one thing: amphibious attacks follow the path of least resistance. Land on the beach closest to the objective. Go the obvious route. For 3 years of island warfare, the Japanese had thoroughly studied U.S. Marine Corps tactics. They knew exactly where Colonel Bucky Harris and his 3rd Battalion would land. They could practically set their watches by it. Once again, we remind you, stay with us until the very end so you don't miss any details of this thrilling story. Your support through likes, subscriptions, and comments indicating your location is invaluable to us. But as dawn broke over the Pacific, Japanese gunners, peering through their sights, saw only an empty spit. Their fingers froze on the triggers, awaiting the inevitable assault into their perfectly planned trap. The kill zone was flawless. The timing was ideal. But the Marines were nowhere to be seen. Instead, the sound of naval artillery came from a completely different direction. Colonel Harris had tossed all the textbooks aside and was striking from the rear. The morning sun cast long shadows over Ngibus Island as Colonel William Bucky Harris carefully surveyed the terrain through his field binoculars. From his position aboard the command ship, the narrow spit connecting this small coral atoll to the northern tip of Peleliu looked exactly what it was: a trap promising certain death. The Japanese had spent weeks preparing a warm welcome for the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Harris could clearly distinguish each carefully placed gun emplacement, every mortar pit, every machine gun fortification that Major General Hoshi Imamura's forces had carved into the coral and concrete. Intelligence reports, laid out on an improvised table, painted a stark picture. 470 Japanese defenders had turned Ngibus into an impenetrable fortress, specifically designed for the complete annihilation of Marines attempting the obvious approach. The spit was barely 50 yards wide at low tide, a perfect funnel that would compress his battalion into a killing field, where crossfire would mow down his men like wheat before a harvest. Every artillery piece on the island was sighted precisely on this narrow strip of coral and sand. The Japanese had done their homework flawlessly. Harris lowered his binoculars and turned to Captain Walter Stout, whose weather-beaten face reflected the same grim assessment of the situation. "They expect us to come straight across that spit," Harris stated, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had seen too many predictable attacks end in disaster. "Every gun on this island is aimed at the most obvious landing zone." Stout nodded, studying aerial photographs that depicted the intricate defensive network. "Standard doctrine states, we land on the nearest beach and advance to the objective. This spit is the shortest route to the island." He paused, tracing the narrow strip with his finger. "But it's also suicide." Around them, preparations continued with mechanical precision. LVT amphibious landing craft bobbed on the morning swells, their crews conducting final checks on engines and armaments. The battleships USS Iowa and USS New Jersey had already begun their preliminary bombardment, their 16-inch shells roaring overhead to crash down on the obvious landing zones. F-4U Corsair fighters circled above, awaiting the signal to dive on their assigned targets. Everything was proceeding according to the standard amphibious operations scenario that had brought Marines across the Pacific countless times. But Harris had spent 3 years watching Marines die following that very same scenario on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan. He had seen what happened when American forces did exactly what the Japanese expected them to do. The enemy had studied Marine tactics with the same meticulous attention they applied to everything else, and they had learned to prepare their defenses accordingly. The obvious approach always proved to be the most heavily defended. Sergeant John Red Macaulay approached the command group, his squad leaders following him. The veteran NCO's eyes held the same skeptical look Harris had come to recognize in Marines who had survived enough amphibious operations to develop an instinct for impending trouble. "Colonel, the men are asking about the landing plan," Macaulay said. "They see those gun positions just as clearly as we do." Harris turned away from the spit and looked southeast, where the open ocean stretched to the horizon. The seaward side of Ngibus presented a completely different tactical picture. The beaches were narrower, more exposed to waves, and further from the obvious objective, but they were also virtually undefended. Reconnaissance photos showed only scattered observation posts and light gun positions along the southeastern coast. The Japanese had concentrated their forces where they expected the attack. "We are not going across the spit," Harris announced, his decision solidifying the moment he spoke. The assembled officers exchanged glances, recognizing the moment their commander was about to rewrite the tactical playbook. "We will hit them from the sea," he continued, and the boldness of the plan immediately struck them. A shore-to-shore, amphibious operation, starting in the open ocean, would require the Marines to traverse almost 2 miles in unprotected landing craft, battling surf and waves that could swamp their vehicles or break their formation. They would attack the long way, foregoing the advantages of surprise and concentrated firepower that a direct approach offered. But it would also put them where the Japanese least expected them. While Imamura's forces waited in their perfectly prepared kill zone, Harris's Marines would be landing on beaches that had been deliberately left lightly defended because no rational commander would choose such a difficult approach. Stout studied the southeast coast through his binoculars, calculating distances and approach angles. The surf looks manageable, but we'll be completely exposed during the approach if they spot us early and shift their guns. Then all their efforts would be in vain. But Harris had seen this game before and knew that sometimes the only way to win is to change the rules when no one expects it. And that's what we'll discuss next: how one man's courage turned the tide of battle, and what lessons we can draw from this for our own battles for success. Do you think you know what failure looks like? Are you sure you're ready for the worst? Well, imagine a situation where all your efforts, months of planning, and years of training suddenly prove useless. When every step, every decision, every invested time and resource leads to catastrophe because you were preparing for the wrong battle. This isn't just a mistake, it's a failure of the entire system, a paradigm shift that turns the world upside down. Remember how we've often talked about the importance of adaptation and foresight. We've emphasized that expectations can be deceptive and familiar schemes can be deadly. Today's story isn't just a war story. It's a lesson on how strategies stuck in the past can lead to collapse, and how one bold decision can change the course of events. It's about being one step ahead when the enemy expects predictability from you. Stay with us and watch until the end to understand how to avoid such mistakes and always be one step ahead. We would be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, please write in the comments where you are watching from. General Harris, with a face carved from stone, interrupted the discussion about redeploying heavy guns. They won't have time, he cut in. All their heavy weaponry is positioned to cover the causeway. Redeployment will take hours, and by then we'll be ashore. His gesture pointed to the almost undefended beaches. Intelligence shows about 50 men covering 2 miles of coastline. We can break through there and flank their positions while they wait for us on the causeway. This plan violated all principles of a traditional amphibious operation. Marines were taught to choose the shortest path to the objective, concentrate forces at the point of attack, and use overwhelming firepower to suppress enemy defenses. Harris, however, proposed stretching the battalion across a wide front, approaching from the most difficult direction, and foregoing the concentrated artillery support that made amphibious operations possible. But it was precisely this unconventional thinking that could catch the Japanese off guard. For 3 years, American forces had fought a predictable war, following a doctrine that the enemy had learned to anticipate and neutralize. The Japanese had built their entire defensive strategy on the assumption that the Marines would do what they always did. Stay with us and watch until the end to understand how to avoid such mistakes and always be one step ahead. We would be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, please write in the comments where you are watching from. Macaulay's weathered face broke into a slow smile as all the implications became clear. They'll be looking the wrong way when we land. Exactly, Harris confirmed. While they watch an empty causeway, we'll come in through their back door. He turned to his staff officers. the decision was made. Signal the fleet. We're changing the landing plan. Naval artillery shifts to the southeastern beaches. Air support concentrates on inland positions. And get me the battalion commanders. We'll show the Japanese what happens when you prepare for the last war, not this one. Word spread quickly through the flotilla, relayed by signal flags and radio transmissions that would re-engineer the morning's battle before the first Marines set foot on the island. The first LVT landing craft, their tracks churning into the water that changed color from deep blue to lighter shades, indicating the approach to Ngibus Island, began their run at 0630. Harris rode in the lead vehicle with Stout's company, watching the southeastern beaches grow larger through the spray-streaked windshield. Behind them, 23 more tracked vehicles carried the assault waves of the 3rd Battalion, their engines running at their limit, battling Pacific swells that threatened to break formation. The naval bombardment shifted precisely as Harris ordered. Instead of shelling the obvious landing zones by the causeway, the 16-inch guns of the Iowa and New Jersey directed their shells inland, targeting command bunkers and supply depots that reconnaissance had identified via aerial photography. The sound of the big guns from this angle was different. Their muzzle flashes were visible on the horizon as each salvo roared overhead to detonate among the coral ridges, where Major General Imamura had positioned his reserves. From his command bunker overlooking the causeway, Private First Class Tatsuji Isida pressed his eye to the periscope and scanned the approaches, awaiting the American assault. The morning bombardment intensified, but the shells were falling in the wrong places, hitting sections with no strategic value for an attack across the narrow land bridge. Perhaps the American artillerymen were just warming up their weapons, or maybe their intelligence was flawed. In any case, Isida and his comrades remained focused on the kill zone they had prepared for weeks. Machine gun nests carved into the coral had perfect fields of fire. Mortar pits were zeroed to the meter. Every approach across the causeway had been mapped, measured, and recorded for indirect fire support. When the Marines charged across that narrow strip of land, they would run straight into overlapping cones of automatic fire that would cut them down before they covered 50 yards. The plan was flawless. 2 miles away, the first wave of LVTs landed on the southeastern beaches of Ngibus Island. Resistance was exactly as Harris had predicted. Scattered rifle fire from observation posts manned by soldiers tasked with watching for diversionary attacks, not repelling a major assault. Sergeant Macaulay's squad landed on the beach in the 3rd vehicle, their boots sloshing through the shallows onto coral sand that crunched beneath their gear. Japanese positions on this section of the coast consisted mainly of camouflaged foxholes and a few concrete observation bunkers built to spot approaching fleets, not to engage landing forces. The defenders had light weapons, rifles, a few machine guns and mortars, but nothing like the concentrated firepower that awaited along the causeway. They fought with the desperate courage of soldiers who knew they were vastly outnumbered. But their resistance quickly crumbled under the onslaught of a full-scale Marine battalion attack. Stout's company advanced inland with mechanical precision, using flamethrowers to clear bunkers and demolition charges to destroy observation posts. Each fallen position opened gaps in the Japanese defensive line, allowing more Marines to break through and secure ground that Imamura's forces never expected to seriously defend. The southeastern beaches were a calculated risk in the Japanese defensive plan, too difficult to attack to warrant heavy fortification, but close enough to main positions to be reinforced if necessary. But there was no time for reinforcement. By 007, Harris had 3 companies ashore, and they were moving inland, pushing through coconut groves and coral formations that provided natural cover from the heavy weaponry positioned to defend the causeway. The surprise was complete. Have you ever wondered what could happen if all your carefully laid plans collapse in an instant? Imagine a situation. You spent weeks, months creating a perfect defense, anticipated every threat, and then the attack comes from where no one expected it. This is exactly what happened on the small but strategically important island of Ngibus, where Japanese forces found themselves trapped by their own perceptions of war. How is this possible? How can you outmaneuver an opponent who seems to have prepared for everything? Perhaps you've also encountered something similar in your life, when your efforts were devalued due to an unforeseen circumstance or an opponent's unconventional move. Today, we will show you how American Marines not only won the battle, but completely overturned tactical doctrine, making the impossible possible. We will reveal the secret that literally made Japanese commanders scratch their heads trying to understand what was happening. Forget everything you knew about classic amphibious operations. There were no frontal assaults on fortified positions, no bloody storms usually associated with capturing Pacific islands. Instead, a move was employed that broke all patterns and forced the enemy to attack itself. Stay with us and watch until the end, because what you learn will forever change your understanding of tactics and strategy. We would be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, don't forget to write in the comments where you are watching us from. Chaos reigned on the radio waves. Japanese commanders desperately tried to comprehend what was happening, as American naval artillery fire was pounding their rear areas, while frontline positions remained untouched. The first counterattack was launched by a reserve company deployed in the central part of the island. Private Esida, rifle clutched in sweat-dampened hands, ran through completely unfamiliar terrain. In that moment, the monstrousness of the situation dawned on him. The Americans had not crossed the causeway as expected. They were already ashore, already advancing through areas that should have been absolutely safe, and already threatening the carefully constructed defensive network from a direction never considered potentially dangerous. This was just a prelude to further events that would show how deeply the American Marines had penetrated. Battles in the island's interior were fierce, but surprisingly swift. Japanese soldiers, trained for static defense, found themselves dragged into dynamic combat against Marines who had honed their tactics over 3 years of island campaigns. Personal bravery could not compensate for the overwhelming tactical surprise and numerical superiority. Pillboxes, whose embrasures faced the sea, proved completely defenseless against attacks from their blind spots. Machine gun nests oriented towards the causeway could not pivot quickly enough to engage targets approaching from the dense jungle. Every new American step only intensified the defenders' sense of hopelessness, foreshadowing a rapid loss of control. And remember, friends, To not miss the most interesting parts and support our channel, stay with us and watch until the end. We would be especially grateful for your like and subscription. And of course, don't forget to share in the comments where you joined us from. Macaulay's squad encountered the fiercest resistance near the communications bunker, which housed the radio equipment, connecting the island to the main Japanese command on Peleliu. This bunker was skillfully integrated into a coral ridge, providing excellent fields of fire towards obvious landing zones. However, its rear entrance was guarded by only a few riflemen who expected to see desperate survivors from a frontal assault, not fresh Marines advancing through covered terrain. A flamethrower team moved forward under covering fire, their weapons hissing as they spewed streams of jellied gasoline into the bunker's embrasures. The explosion, when the position's internal fuel tanks ignited, was heard halfway across the island, sending a column of black smoke high into the morning sky. With the destruction of this communication hub, Japanese units across Ngibus lost contact with their headquarters and each other, turning coordinated defense into scattered pockets of resistance. This was a critical moment that finally disorganized the enemy and opened the way for the next phase of the operation. By Oro 830, Harris had achieved what traditional amphibious doctrine considered impossible. His Marines had not only secured a beachhead without sustaining serious casualties, but had also advanced deep into the island, encountering minimal resistance, and seized key heights dominating the approaches to the main Japanese positions. The perfect kill zone that Major General Imamura had so meticulously prepared still awaited along the causeway, its guns aimed at empty water, while American forces consolidated their positions on ground considered impregnable. The tactical situation was completely reversed in less than 2 hours. Instead of assaulting prepared positions from the most difficult direction, the Marines now occupied the dominant heights and could destroy Japanese fortifications from the rear. This created ideal conditions for the systematic destruction of the entire defensive system, which we will now describe. The systematic destruction of Ngibus Island's defensive network began precisely at 09 Wawosori, as Harris's Marines shifted their focus to the very fortifications Major General Imamura had spent weeks meticulously designing. Coastal pillboxes, engineered for the mass annihilation of Marines crossing the causeway, now found themselves under fire from their unprotected rear approaches. Their heavy concrete walls and steel reinforcements were utterly useless against an enemy who had already completely bypassed the kill zone. Stout's company advanced through the defensive positions, like a demolition brigade. Each bunker presented the same tactical problem, for which the same destructive solution had already been found. The Japanese had constructed their fortifications to withstand a frontal assault from the sea. Thick concrete faced the ocean, and interlocking fields of fire covered every approach from the obvious landing zones. However, the rear entrances were protected only by camouflaged steel doors, designed to prevent infiltration by lone saboteurs, not to repel organized infantry attacks. The first major strongpoint fell to a coordinated assault that became the template for all subsequent attacks. While one squad provided covering fire, suppressing any Japanese soldiers who might try to reinforce the position, Macaulay's flamethrower team approached from the bunker's blind side. Portable flamethrower weapons hissed, spewing jets of jellied gasoline through ventilation shafts and embrasures, filling the concrete chamber with superheated gases that rendered the position uninhabitable in seconds. When the steel door finally opened, the surviving defenders stumbled out, with their hands raised, their uniforms scorched, and weapons abandoned in the raging inferno behind them. The bunker, designed to hold an entire Marine battalion for many hours, was neutralized by a 4-man team in less than 10 minutes. The tactical advantage of attacking from an unexpected direction transformed what should have been a multi-day battle into a series of short, one-sided engagements. Private First Class Ishida found himself trapped in a mortar pit, positioned to rain shells on Marines attempting to cross the causeway. The circular concrete fortification was built with a narrow entrance facing inland, away from the expected direction of attack. But this very entrance now provided easy access for American forces, who had already penetrated the defensive perimeter. The mortar itself, a Type 97 weapon, was capable of firing 81mm shells with devastating accuracy. However, its fixed position meant it could only target predetermined zones that the Marines had already bypassed. The sound of approaching footsteps on the coral scree told Ishida his position had been discovered. Through a narrow embrasure, he could see American soldiers moving through territory that should have been occupied by Japanese reserves. The defensive plan called for these reserves to counterattack any American forces that managed to secure a beachhead, pushing them back into the sea before they could consolidate their positions. Instead, the reserves were scattered and destroyed piecemeal, caught off guard by an attack that materialized from a completely unthinkable direction. Have you ever experienced that piercing feeling when your meticulously crafted plan, seemingly flawless, suddenly crumbles to dust from a threat you couldn't even imagine? This isn't just a story about battles and strategy. It's a deep dive into human drama, where absolute confidence in one's abilities turns into the bitterest disappointment. We have often encountered situations where seemingly insurmountable obstacles became so only because we were looking in the wrong direction. Today we will uncover 3 fatal errors that transformed an impregnable citadel into a trap for its defenders. And the first of these is the tragic blindness to the unexpected. You will learn how the most reliable fortifications, built with incredible diligence and engineering genius, proved powerless in the face of unconventional thinking. Stay with us and watch until the end. We would be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you are watching us from. When the flamethrower team reached the fortification, the garrison commander, Major Hashimoto, faced the same dilemma as hundreds of his soldiers before him. Surrendering meant preserving his life, but also acknowledging complete defeat. The perfect defensive plan had been utterly outmaneuvered by an enemy who refused to follow a predictable script. The concrete walls, which had provided so much confidence during weeks of preparation, now felt like a tomb, trapping him in a tactically useless position. The flamethrower's fuel tank ignited, and the air inside the mortar dugout filled with a deafening roar that could be heard 50 meters away. Hashimoto, forgetting his rifle, backed towards the exit, his hands already rising above his head as he stepped into the sunlight, which, after the gloom of the burning fortification, seemed unbearably bright. Another position had fallen. Another fragment of General Okada's defensive network was destroyed, and the systematic destruction of Ningho Island continued with relentless efficiency. By 10 o'clock in the morning, Captain McFarland had reorganized his battalion for the final phase of the assault. The southeastern beaches now served as a reliable supply line, with additional landing craft delivering ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements across a 2-mile stretch of open water that had seemed so insurmountable during initial planning. What was initially perceived as a disadvantage, the long, open approach from the sea, had turned into a strategic advantage, allowing the Marines to sustain their operations without relying on the contested causeway. Japanese positions along the northwestern coast represented the last organized resistance on the island. These were bunkers and artillery fortifications built to control the approaches from Peleliu. The heavy weaponry was intended to turn the causeway into a killing field for any American forces attempting to cross it. Their concrete walls faced the sea. Embrasure slits provided perfect fields of fire across the narrow strait of water, and underground chambers contained enough ammunition to sustain weeks of defensive fighting. But all of them were facing the wrong way. The Marines were approaching from land, moving through coconut groves and coral formations that provided natural cover, until they were close enough to use demolition charges and flamethrowers against the unprotected rear entrances. Each fallen position opened new avenues of approach for assault teams, creating a cascading collapse that accelerated as the morning progressed. The largest bunker complex housed a 96mm coastal gun, designed to engage American warships attempting to provide fire support for amphibious operations. The gun could fire a 150mm shell with enough accuracy to damage or sink cruisers over 16 kilometers away, making it a significant threat to naval forces supporting the Marine assault. Its concrete fortification was built to withstand direct hits from battleship guns, with walls 2 meters thick and a steel-reinforced roof capable of deflecting even 406mm shells. The gun crew inside the bunker had trained for months to engage surface targets approaching from the sea. They knew the ranges to every prominent landmark, could calculate firing solutions for moving targets, and maintain accurate fire even under the heaviest counter-barrage. What they had never trained for was defending their position against an infantry assault from land, as such an attack was considered impossible, given the defensive structures that were supposed to protect the interior of the island. When Sergeant McCalley's squad reached the rear entrance to the bunker, they found a steel door designed to protect against saboteurs, not combat engineers with shaped charges. The explosion blew the door off its hinges and sent shock waves through the concrete chamber that left the gun crew stunned and disoriented. Within minutes, the most powerful weapon on Ngibus Island was silenced by a handful of Marines who had approached from a direction that defensive planners had never seriously considered. The systematic destruction of each position created a tactical momentum that became unstoppable as the Japanese defensive network collapsed from within. The final Japanese counterattack began at 11:30, when surviving elements of Major General Imamura's garrison attempted to retake the central ridge that controlled access to their remaining positions. The assault began simultaneously from 3 directions, coordinated by junior officers who had managed to maintain radio communication despite the destruction of the main command bunker. This represented the last organized resistance the defenders could offer, a desperate attempt to reverse the tactical situation before the Marines completed the systematic destruction of the island's defenses. Private First Class. Ashita found himself part of a hastily assembled force that included survivors from coastal bunkers, reserve troops caught off guard in their barracks by the sudden attack, and even cooks and clerks pressed into service as riflemen. The plan was simple in its desperation. Assault the open ground towards American positions, breach their perimeter, and retake the height that would allow the remaining heavy guns to shell the Marine beachhead. Success would restore the defensive network and trap American forces between the sea and revitalized Japanese positions. Failure would mean the complete collapse of organized resistance on Ngibus Island. In this final clash, the terrain favored the defenders. The central ridge was riddled with natural coral caves and man-made tunnels that provided hidden routes between positions, allowing small groups of Japanese soldiers to approach within grenade-throwing distance of Marine trenches. These underground passages had been dug over weeks of preparation, creating a network of hidden positions that could support each other even when above-ground structures were destroyed. The Americans would have to root out each cave individually, using flamethrowers and demolition charges in close-quarters combat, which would negate their advantages in firepower and mobility. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where it felt as if the enemy had read your every move, anticipated every decision, building a perfect trap around you? When circumstances press from all sides, and hopes of salvation dwindle with each passing moment, it was in such a seemingly hopeless situation that the American Marines on Ngibus Island found themselves. But their story is not one of defeat, but of how the most sophisticated defensive plans can collapse if one crucial factor is ignored: human ingenuity. In this video, we will reveal how a fortress, once deemed impregnable, turned into a trap for its own creators, and we will show 3 tactical moves that completely changed the course of the battle. Sergeant Macaulay and his squad held positions in shell-pocked craters located at the very top of the ridge. From here, they had an excellent view of all approaches from the north and west, allowing them to control the area. The Marines had already learned to infallibly recognize the subtle signs of Japanese underground works: slight depressions in the coral surface, patches of discolored vegetation, ventilation shafts artfully camouflaged as natural formations. Each such cave mouth represented a potential threat, a source of enemy fire requiring constant attention and immediate response upon detecting any movement. The first signals of the impending counterattack came from Macaulay's tripwires, placed along the most likely enemy approach routes. The thin steel cables, salvaged from damaged Japanese communication equipment, were virtually invisible in the morning twilight but made a distinctive sound when brushed by advancing troops. The sergeant heard this distinct chime of broken wire from 3 different directions within just 30 seconds. This confirmed that the enemy was undertaking a coordinated assault, rather than isolated infiltration attempts that had characterized the preceding hours of fighting. Stay with us and watch until the end, as we would be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you are watching this video from. The coordination of the Marines' response was handled by Captain Stout from his command post, located in a captured Japanese bunker. He used the very same underground telephone lines that had previously connected the enemy's defensive network to maintain communication with his dispersed platoons. The irony was not lost. American forces were now using Japanese infrastructure to defend against Japanese attacks, completely reversing the tactical situation. The original defensive plan, devised by the Japanese, had turned against its creators, becoming a real problem for them. The fiercest fighting unfolded around a complex of interconnected caves, where the remnants of a Japanese machine gun company were sheltering. Type 96 light machine guns had been repositioned to fire from hidden positions within the coral formations. Muzzle flashes were invisible to observers on the surface, but their flanking fire was deadly to anyone attempting to cross the open ground between marine positions. Each such weapon was supported by riflemen armed with Type 38 bolt-action rifles, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned any advance into a carefully calculated risk. Colonel Harris moved between his company's positions, assessing the tactical situation and making decisions that would determine whether the counterattack could be held or if it would force his Marines to abandon their hard-won positions. The Japanese assault proved more organized than he had expected, indicating that enemy commanders had managed to retain some level of control despite the destruction of their communication network. Individual acts of bravery were coordinated into cohesive tactical movements, transforming what should have been a desperate last stand into a real threat to American positions. Stay with us and watch until the end, as we would be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you are watching this video from. The turning point came when a Marine flamethrower team managed to reach the entrance of the main cave complex, despite a hail of fire from Japanese machine gun positions. This portable incendiary weapon was designed specifically for this kind of close-quarters combat. Its mixture of jellied gasoline capable of penetrating confined spaces where conventional explosives would be ineffective. The operator, a corporal from Kansas, whose steady hands had cleared dozens of bunkers that morning, approached the cave mouth with the methodical precision of a craftsman, applying a familiar tool to a well-understood problem. This was one of the 3 tactical moves we spoke about at the beginning, and its consequences were devastating. The very first blast of flame illuminated the interior of the cave system, revealing the scale of the Japanese positions and the number of defenders sheltering in the coral passages. Superheated gases instantly filled every chamber and tunnel, creating an environment deadly to anyone remaining underground. Within minutes, organized resistance from the cave complex was completely suppressed, eliminating a key strong point of the entire Japanese defensive line. Ashita emerged from a secondary tunnel 50 yards from the main cave entrance, his uniform scorched and rifle lost somewhere in the smoke-filled passages behind him. The retreat quickly devolved into a panicked rout as surviving Japanese soldiers abandoned their positions and fled towards the northern tip of the island, where a few scattered bunkers still gave the illusion of defensive strength. The counterattack had failed completely, exhausting the last reserves of organized resistance in a futile attempt to change a tactical situation that had been hopeless from the moment the Marines landed on the wrong beaches. But how did this mistake turn into a strategic advantage? More on that next. By 12 hours, the systematic destruction of Japanese positions resumed with mechanical efficiency. Each remaining bunker was isolated, surrounded, and destroyed using the same methods that had proven effective throughout the morning. Flamethrowers cleared internal spaces, demolition charges collapsed concrete structures, and rifle fire eliminated any defenders attempting to escape. the ideal kill zone that Major General Imamura had designed to annihilate an entire Marine battalion, was turned against him, becoming a trap for its creators rather than their enemies. The final count of casualties after the counterattack eloquently testified to a complete shift in the tactical situation. 470 Japanese soldiers were killed or captured, compared to 15 Marines killed and 33 wounded. The calculus of amphibious operations had been rewritten by a commander who refused to follow the obvious plan, thereby demonstrating the second and third key techniques we mentioned. This was not merely luck, but the result of a deep understanding of the enemy. The silence that fell over Ngibus Island at 1 p.m. on September 29th carried a weight that spoke louder than the morning's roar of guns. Colonel Harris stood amidst the wreckage of what was once Major General Imamura's perfect defensive network, surveying concrete bunkers reduced to ruins and firing positions that would never again threaten American forces attempting to cross the narrow causeway. The transformation was complete. A fortress that had taken weeks to build and fortify was dismantled in less than 6 hours by Marines who refused to attack it in the manner its builders expected. This is a story of how even the most meticulously crafted plans can be shattered by unconventional thinking and determination, turning the pain of defeat into the triumph of victory. Do you think you know what true failure looks like? Does it feel like all your efforts are going to waste because you blindly follow outdated rules? Perhaps you're familiar with the feeling of pouring all your energy into preparation, only to realize that the enemy was playing by entirely different rules, rendering all your hard work useless. Today, we'll uncover the secret of how one battle redefined warfare, demonstrating that innovation and unconventional thinking can negate the most thorough defensive plans. We'll tell you how American Marines, against all expectations, achieved a complete victory with minimal casualties, and how their tactics literally forced Japanese commanders to rethink their entire defensive strategy. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The builders of the fortifications clearly underestimated the force of the coming blow. The tactical implications of this operation extended far beyond the coral beaches of the small Pacific atoll. Commander Harris graphically demonstrated that traditional amphibious assault doctrine could be entirely rewritten if commanders were willing to abandon predictable approaches in favor of innovative thinking. The classic solution for Ngibus Island would have involved a frontal assault across the causeway, supported by massive naval bombardment and preceded by days of airstrikes designed to soften the defensive positions. Such an attack would ultimately have succeeded, but at the cost of hundreds of American casualties and weeks of fierce fighting. Instead, the Marines achieved complete victory in 48 hours, incurring losses that were hardly comparable to the scale of operations in the Pacific Theater. 15 killed and 33 wounded represented tragic losses for families and units, but this was a mere fraction of what traditional wisdom predicted for assaulting such heavily fortified positions. 470 Japanese defenders were utterly destroyed as an organized fighting force, their meticulously prepared defenses rendered useless in the face of an enemy who approached from a completely unexpected direction. Captain Stout walked through the Central Command bunker, which had served as Imamura's headquarters during the preparation phase, examining maps and documents that revealed the meticulous planning invested in fortifying the island. The Japanese had studied American amphibious tactics with the same attention to detail that characterized all their military preparations. They identified the most likely landing zones, calculated optimal placements for their heavy weaponry, and created overlapping fields of fire that would decimate any force attempting the obvious approach. The defensive plan was tactically sound, operationally thorough, and strategically irrelevant. It was designed to counter the tactics of a previous war, not to adapt to the innovative thinking that characterized the best American commanders. Imamura had prepared his forces for a repeat of the Battle of Tarawa, creating kill zones that would be devastating to Marines following established doctrine. But Harris had studied those same battles and drew different conclusions about the relationship between tactical surprise and operational success. Sergeant Macaulay oversaw the destruction of remaining Japanese equipment, ensuring that weapons and ammunition that survived the morning's fighting could not be used by infiltrators or remaining forces. Type 96 machine guns, positioned to rake the causeway, were disassembled into components to be sent back to American intelligence units for technical analysis. A coastal defense gun, capable of threatening cruisers and destroyers, was destroyed with shaped charges that left its steel barrel twisted and its concrete emplacement cracked beyond repair. The systematic destruction served both practical and psychological purposes. Practically, it ensured that Ngibus Island could never again serve as a base for Japanese operations against American forces on Peleliu or in adjacent waters. Psychologically, it sent a message to enemy commanders across the Pacific that meticulously planned defensive preparations were no guarantee against innovative American tactics. The perfect kill zone became a perfect example of how rigid thinking can be defeated by flexible execution. Private First Class Ashita found himself among the Japanese survivors being processed at a temporary prisoner collection point established by the Marines near the southeastern beaches. The irony was evident. He was held on the very ground where American troops had landed that morning, on beaches that Japanese planners had dismissed as too difficult to assault and too insignificant to heavily fortify. His capture occurred not because he fought poorly, but because the entire defensive concept had been outmaneuvered before the first shot was fired. The interrogation process revealed the extent to which Japanese forces were psychologically prepared for a completely different battle. Prisoners consistently described their surprise at being attacked from the land rather than the sea, their confusion when American naval artillery targeted rear areas instead of coastal positions, and their inability to coordinate an effective response when communications were severed by attacks on facilities that were supposed to be secure. The tactical surprise was so complete that many defenders never truly understood what was happening until their positions were overrun. Intelligence officers documented weapons and equipment that provided insight into Japanese defensive doctrine and technological capabilities. The bunker construction methods demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how to create positions capable of withstanding heavy bombardment. But they also revealed assumptions about the direction from which attacks would come. Embrasures faced seaward. Communication lines connected positions along the expected axis of advance, and supply routes were designed to support forces engaged in a prolonged frontal engagement, not a mobile defense against multiple directions of attack. Harris submitted his after-action report, from the deck of the command ship, while landing craft continued to ferry supplies and personnel between the mainland and the newly secured island. The tactical lessons learned at Ngibus would influence amphibious operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific campaign, demonstrating that innovative thinking could achieve decisive results with minimal casualties when applied against enemies who prepared for predictable attacks. The strategic significance extended beyond the immediate tactical victory. Japanese forces across the Pacific had invested immense resources in creating defensive networks based on the assumption that American commanders would follow established amphibious assault doctrine. If these assumptions could be consistently disproven, the entire Japanese defensive strategy would require a fundamental re-evaluation at a time when resources and manpower were already stretched thin. Have you ever felt that despite titanic efforts, your videos lose a lion's share of viewers within the first few seconds? That familiar pain when hours are spent on shooting and editing, but statistics mercilessly show most simply leave without watching to the end. We perfectly understand this feeling. We ourselves have experienced how brilliant, in our opinion, ideas crashed against a wall of audience indifference as the retention metric crawled downwards like a crippled airplane. However, there is a proven way to turn this situation around. In this comprehensive guide, we will reveal 3 fundamental techniques that will not just hold a viewer's attention, but also make them subconsciously feel a deep connection to your content, ensuring astonishing retention of over 70% within the first minute, and often significantly more. And here is the first of these powerful tools. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. You might not even realize it, but you are making one critical mistake in every one of your introductions that, like an invisible anchor, drags your channel to the bottom. This isn't just a minor flaw. It's a fatal error that kills your statistics before you even get to the main part. Forget everything you've been taught about a soft entry and gradual immersion into a topic. That's pure misconception, a myth that only lulls your audience to sleep and makes them scroll further. The real magic begins when you dare to break the conventional boundaries. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. So, once the introduction has captured attention, a natural question arises. How do you maintain that interest throughout the video? The answer lies in a concept we call the infinite hook. This isn't just a series of separate segments. It's a carefully designed, continuous narrative thread where each meaningful block seamlessly flows into the next, leaving behind a subtle but undeniable hint of what's to come. The viewer, immersed in this cohesive story, should not even guess where one thought ends and another begins. For them, it is a single captivating stream of information, where each element serves as preparation for the next, sustaining an unflagging interest. All internal divisions into introduction, main part, or conclusion exist only in your internal planning kitchen as a tool. For the audience, however, it is a continuous, engaging journey where curiosity is constantly fueled by new discoveries. We create not just a video, but a complete architecture of attention, where every transition is not a stop, but a springboard. Imagine a river that flows, winding and changing its course, but never stopping. Your video should be that river, carrying the viewer along from one bank to another, without visible stops or drops.